I want to hand over to you, Claude.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the hiccup at the beginning, but we are going to start now with a prayer led by one of the people in the audience. Over to you.
God and Father, we thank you for the gift of a new day. We thank you for the gift of life that you've given each one of us.
We are going to start with somebody who is going to take us through the ethical legal frameworks in the region, and maybe you will be able to answer some of the questions that were raised yesterday about the ethical legal frameworks. And to shed light on this, we have a colleague, my colleague, Francis Kombe, an alumni of the Sarid project of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, an expert on research integrity, who has published and done research in that area, and who is now working in South Africa, although he's a Kenyan, our neighbor. And I think he's also a founder of the IRIN, which was being asked about yesterday. So without wasting time, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kombe. Francis, are you online? Are you online, Francis? Dr. Kombe, he was online a while ago.
Speak in your microphone, more sound.
Those who are in control room, are you in touch with Dr. Kombe?
Just go closer to the microphone or the internet. Do you hear us? Is that better? Dr. Kombe, are you online?
ICT could help us.
Yes, he's online. Dr. Kombe, are you online? Right. So as we wait for Dr. Kombe, because I think we see him online, maybe he's not able to hear us, but Cloud, you were
Yeah,
going on a little bit about the session as
Yeah.
we wait for him.
As we wait for Francis to come online, research has indicated
Just adjust your microphone. It's a little, yes.
research has indicated that there have been gaps in the regulatory frameworks, especially when it comes to research integrity and responsible conduct of research. We have studies carried out by Dr. Mwaka, 2017, but prior to that, there was one by Francis Kombe et al. In 2014. We have had the East African Commission on Health Research giving briefs to do with unification of reviews. We've had the publication from Juliet Nabionga et al. Also looking at regulatory frameworks. And all these were pointing out gaps in the regulatory frameworks. One is as recent as 2021. I think the one from Nabionga is as recent as 2021. So we are eager to hear, are there developments with regard to that? Are we somewhere close to having those regulatory guideline frameworks? If there are gaps, what is in place or what is being planned? And what is the way forward? So we expect that Kombe Francis, being one of the researchers in this area, is going to help us shed some light on this. Even I think one of the presentations yesterday by Dr. Lin was alluding to this, because Dr. Lin is also part of the African Research Integrity Network, and we expect much from this. And so the participants, you can be preparing your questions. And in this, we are encouraging you to use Q&A instead of the chat, because the chat being men online, we can clog the chat and the questions might get lost. So we are encouraging you to use Q&A. Some of the questions can be answered as they come in, and some will come at the end. Francis, if you're online, over to you. Thank you.
The sound, dear colleagues, we are working on the sound, participants, but we also need to adjust the lower, just the top of the microphone. If it moves, the upper top.
But is Francis on?
Just right.
It doesn't.
Yes, that one moves like that, so that it's in front of you.
Maybe is Francis on?
Francis can't hear us.
But it can't be that the sound is so low that one cannot.
But I see a lot of members in the chat who can't hear us. The chat.
The problem could be in the control room. It's not this microphone.
There is no sound at all. So it has to be technical,
it is technical. I don't think it is.
Okay. No audio, but can someone type there? They are typing. A lot of people are typing in the chat. If you can just respond to them, it's
In the meantime, I can be taking us through what to expect today. We have 3 presenters. We've been talking about the keynote speaker, who is going to talk about.
But they don't hear you. So you don't need to.
No, just to keep these ones here.
But they're just here in the piece. They're asking me to ask you to.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe it's also disorganizing. Oh dear.
But because I'm feeling to get a call here. I'm feeling to get a call.
It is weak. Yeah. It is today the network.
network, yeah. I don't have NB. I'm not connecting here. Problem is the network.
So are you asking me to talk?
Because if I was
To the
connected, I would try to use online.
we continue. No, but you want us, but they don't hear us online. So you want us to continue with these people here? I've not understood you. You want us to continue with the audience here?
The network is the problem. It has gone off completely. And there is a new count. Please. They are connected now. But we cannot be able to use that. Are we in now? Okay. Yeah. It seems we are back on air. Thank you for your patience. We're waiting for Dr. Kombe to start his presentation. Like the problem is now resolved. Francis, over to you now.
All right, so in the next
But we are not
25 minutes or so, I will be talking to you about
we don't have network.
the policy, the ethical and legal frameworks for research integrity in East African region. And I've specifically highlighted African there because even though the presentation is about East Africa, my presentation is going to broaden up to the rest of Africa because from the current situation, it appears like the context is similar regards to research integrity in East Africa as well as Africa as a whole. So my presentation is going to touch a bit about East Africa, but also it will also look at the region or the continent as a whole. I'm not going to attempt to define research integrity because I know our previous speakers have talked a lot about what research integrity is all about. So I'm going to basically look at the context, what is happening at the moment in terms of policies and legal frameworks, and end up my presentation with just a conclusion on what I think needs to be done to improve the situation. And before I start my presentation, I want to share experience I had in Uganda. I was in Uganda recently, and I think that was during the Matthias week. And I was seated somewhere when I had a priest preaching over TV, and he gave an example of a story that happened about a family that was at loggerheads with their neighbors. And apparently the husband woke up one night and decided to mess up with the banana plants of the neighbor, cut them off, all of them. And the neighbor, the following day went to the police, reported the incident. And when the police arrested the guy who had cut down the banana trees, the guy sort of identified the wife as the key witness. So when the wife was invited to take oath and give, just her side of the story, she took the Bible and so as is usually the case, she had to swear to God that what she was going to say was the truth and nothing but the truth. And obviously, the husband expected that the wife would defend her own husband because she knew the truth, but apparently she was the key witness in this case. But after the wife saw using the Bible, what came out from the wife was totally different from what the husband expected, because she said, yes, the truth is on that particular day, my husband woke up in the middle of the night and cut down all the banana plants of our neighbor. Now, I'm giving this story because it really resonates very well with, the theme of this conference about research integrity. Because for me, when I look at research integrity, and several speakers alluded to the same yesterday, it's about doing the right thing anytime, regardless of who is watching you or regardless of who is there, doing the right thing all the time in your capacity as a researcher. So I want us to remember that, because even though I'm not going to attempt to define what research integrity is all about, I want us to always remember that when we talk about research integrity, it's really, really important to think about doing the right thing anytime, regardless of who is watching. Now, as a way of introduction, I want to really say that we live in a beautiful continent. I think Africa is one of the most beautiful continents. It is home to nearly 20% of the world population and the second largest continent. It is endowed with a lot of natural resources, as you know, and it is rich in cultural and religious diversity. We still have the highest burden of disease, and of course this has implication in terms of the clinical trials or studies that are happening within the region. We have, on the last decade or so, we have seen quite an increase in the number of clinical trials being conducted in Africa, but also it has come with a lot of complexity. The type of studies that are being conducted in Africa are increasingly becoming more and more complex. Now, this has implication in terms of how ethics review committees ought to come out strongly and robustly, increase the way they review studies in order to increase the protection of research participants. And within the context of research ethics, there has been quite a lot of awareness, support, and even mature systems that have been developed. But if you look at the area of research integrity, there's very little knowledge about what research integrity is all about, and also the support that is geared towards research integrity. All right, so let's look at the historical development of research ethics, because this is key. If you look at how research ethics developed, you realize that the initial international document to really emphasize the need for local ethics review was the Declaration of Helsinki. After this came into this document, sponsors and funders and people who invest in research put their foot down and started demanding that any research that is being done in any country, apart from the research having been approved in the country where it originates, there must be a local ethics review or approval before that funding is released. And the first ethics review committee was established in South Africa in around 1967. It's about half a century since the first ethics review committee was established in Africa. Yet, at the moment, we really cannot confidently say to what extent ethics review committees are truly independent. There's still a lot of political interference, political, power imbalances, and researchers being, drawn from this end to the other end as they seek ethical approval. Ethics review committees have been blamed for being a bottleneck for research, and it is also in the public domain in terms of public publication that not all ethics review committees are well qualified or are well, trained to do the review kind of reviews, in line with the complexities of studies that are being, approved. We still talk a lot about universal ethics, guidelines. Lately, have we been able to talk about, domesticated guidelines that we can really say we own? We still refer a lot about universal guidelines, and how universal these guidelines are is still debatable. Very few countries have been able to go along to develop national regulations, and especially to be able to align studies that are being conducted in their countries in line with their own health priorities. And of course, we do know from data that is published that many ethics review committees still operate under very limited budget. They don't have the right technology. They even lack training, like I already said. We give it to the region because I think, especially from the systematic review that was done by Selemwani and Basna, it's clear that the culture of ethics review is well established at the moment. Now, when we look at the current state for research integrity, it's exactly the opposite. Like other, speakers, alluded to yesterday, there's still a lot of confusion with regards to what exactly is research, integrity, and how different is it from research ethics. There are many instances where research ethics committees are also expected to play the same role as research integrity officers or research integrity administrators. They are, for example, supposed to investigate and follow up research misconduct, which is entirely a different area altogether. So, in terms of support, you see that there's very limited support, both at the national and institutional level, in terms of research integrity, and in terms of funding, there's very little funding that comes through to strengthen the area of research integrity. The professional practices of researchers in East Africa and, of course, in Africa, it's very opaque. There's no formal reporting systems. There are no structures to really, strengthen this area of research integrity and responsible conduct of research. We have no idea what is happening in terms of once research proposals have been approved. What happens on the ground? What do the researchers do on the ground? We have no idea. In fact, many ethics review committees even do not have funding to even just do, monitoring of the proposal that they approve. So, which way and who should do what? Where should we go? How? And what are all the questions that linger around research integrity in and for Africa and East Africa? So if you look at the rest of the world, there's a lot that has been happening over the last decade or so regarding research integrity. After the establishment of the World Conference on Research Integrity Foundation in 2007, every country was the Singapore statement was published in the following year, and 2 years later the Montreal statement was established. Many of the regions, name it, US, UK, the Netherlands, which we had a very very interesting presentation yesterday, have gone to domesticate these principles and developed codes of conduct in terms of research integrity. But where is Africa in all this? Because the rest of the region is moving forward. They have looked at these statements. They have developed codes of conduct to really align how research ought to be done within their countries or within their region. Africa, we are still lagging behind. In fact, I'm sure you heard about the World Conference in Research Integrity, which is coming to Africa for the first time since 15 years ago, when the World Conference or Research Integrity Foundation was established. And for the first time, this conference is going to bring together stakeholders of research integrity just to debate and discuss about the different aspects of research integrity. And excuse me, is someone talking?
Cloud, you need to.
Claudia, are you saying something?
It's interrupting him. Mute your.
All right. I'll continue if you can still hear me. All right. So basically, what I'm saying is we have been lagging in terms of getting onto the coming to the table and shaping how the debate on research integrity is moving forward. And you sit and wonder, so what could be the problems? And the patent questions that we need to ask ourselves. So for example, when we talk about promoting research integrity in Africa, and especially when we talk about policies and legal frameworks, one would wonder, does East Africa or Africa in general really invest in research? We know that Africa, still has the highest burden of disease. And we do know that the kind of resources that are being committed to, conducting research, for diseases that are prevalent in Africa is still only 10%. And a lot of these resources come from the global north. What is it that we are doing in Africa to really fill in this gap? If you look at the scientific output of the region as a whole, it's still only 10%. Now, these are worrying trends. We still rely so much on donor funding for research. And it caused the question, does Africa really see research as fundamental in research and development? Does it see research as important in just developing and having a healthy nation? If you look at the kind of partnership that we enter into, a lot of the African scientists, a lot of the researchers, even as much as they have been involved in partnerships, they're still being viewed as underdogs. Why is this the case? All right. It begs the question, what do you bring on the table for you to be considered as an equal partner? What is it that you bring in the table? Now, I'm not going to offer answers to this, but I'm highlighting these areas because they are really, really important as we, open this, conference, as we open this discussion today. It's really important for us to reflect on these areas. Now, the other area that we really need to think about is even just to take further the issue about collaborations. Why is it that we still rely so much on donor funding? And like I said in my first, very second slide, there has been quite a lot of increase in terms of collaborative research. And suddenly we do hear about decolonization of research and all kind of paradigms that are being propagated around just having ownership and co-creation of research. If you look at the kind of terms and conditions that come with the collaborative research, you sometimes may want to ask yourself, do some of the conditions, some of the terms that are included as part of the collaborative research, do they sometimes create perverse incentives for questionable research practices. There's a lot of hyper competition and excessive pressure to publish. I think several, presenters yesterday, mentioned about this. Our young researchers, and there was a question yesterday about how you can support young researchers. Young researchers are still very vulnerable, and because these are the people who are just getting into the field and looking into, setting their foot. They're looking into getting their first grants.
Dr. Kombe,
And
you have 8
believe
minutes.
me, they will not think twice, even when the terms and conditions that are included in those, contracts and those collaborative, research will not really be promoting responsible conduct of research. There's a lot of inequalities in research partnerships and collaborations, and because of all this is, all this and what is happening around this area, the area around the professional standards and practices of our researchers.
Dr. Kombe, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so what can we do to promote research integrity in East Africa? I will be repeating myself because I have already said this, but also a lot of our research, presenters yesterday mentioned around this area. We need mentorship because if you look at the, the publications around research integrity, mentorship is key. And even though we talk about, supervising PhD students, supervising postgraduate students, the area around mentorship is not well, established in Africa. I do not know, whether this is, well established in Uganda or in Kenya or in East Africa as a region, but from the experiences I've had interacting with many people from Africa generally, this is an area that is really, really, still, yet to be developed. There is need to create awareness because, like I said, there's still a lot of confusion about what research integrity and research ethics is all about. We need to create structures. We need systems for research integrity. At a national level, we need guidelines. We need policies that can go into, creating a conducive environment for a sustainable, research integrity, environment. At an institutional level, we need structures, we need support, and we need systems to promote research integrity. From the African Research Integrity Network, which I am a co-founder and part of, we have been able to identify pockets of initiatives that are currently active in the region. And I give it up to Uganda, kudos, because I know that you have already started the journey towards developing a national guideline for responsible conduct of research. We also have projects funded from the Office of Research Integrity in the US, but being conducted in Kenya. We also have programs at university level in South Africa, and we have training programs in Ghana, Nigeria, and of course, networking and individual champions within the African Research Integrity Network. These are baby steps that we have started, and I really want to encourage everyone who is attending this conference, when you go back, you think about how can you begin to cultivate a culture of responsible conduct of research from in your own little way as an individual, but also within the institution that you work. I want to reference this document because I think it's one of the very important documents that any institution must read when you think about creating an environment for responsible conduct of research. I'm not going to go into the details because the presenter from the Netherlands yesterday, I think, presented in detail about this. But what this document does, it provides, specific areas that as an institution you need to look at, and it provides the topics that are important and the actions that must be taken towards creating an environment that nurtures responsible conduct of research. And for me, that is really, really important. So for anyone or any institution that is really interested in creating an environment for that promotes responsible conduct of research, this is a must-read document. I also want to reference this, this presentation here or this slide from the African Academy of Sciences, and it does provide what, at a national level and at an institutional level, what are the key things that you really, or the key variables that you need to look at. Okay, so you need to think about, creating standards of institutional support for research that is widely recognized in the region. That is important. So we need to come together as a region and think about what are the standards, what are the things that we need to think about when you talk about responsible conduct of research. We saw in the Netherlands that they are doing a large survey to just try to understand some of the, parameters of research misconduct and responsible conduct of research. We mustn't always rely on data that is coming from the global north to use it in Africa. It is time for us to begin to create our own, to understand our own context by developing standards, by doing research to understand what is happening in the region. Institutional leadership, this is really important. Institutional leadership for research management at a senior level within African institutions, because we talked about mentorship, and you can't talk about responsible conduct of research if you do not apply it. Then we need sustainability. We need to look for funds. We need to have sustainable programs for our institutions. At an individual level, we need to build capacity for our researchers, especially upcoming researchers, to be able to understand and appreciate the importance of responsible conduct.
Dr. Kombe, if you hear me, you have 2 minutes.
Important slide for me, because it basically says, yes, responsible conduct of research is an individual, responsibility. But also, individuals do not operate.
Dr. Kombe, if you hear me, you have 2 minutes.
Institutions. All right, thank you. They operate in institutions, and therefore, for them to operate efficiently within those institutions, they need support. They need to understand their potentials, and therefore, institutions should create a conducive environment. They need to create, strategic action points that, nurtures a conducive environment and research ecosystem. So in conclusion, I want to say that research ethics and research integrity are both critical, and they're integral to health research. I don't want to enter into the debate of which one is better, which one comes first. They are integral, and they are all critical for health research. We can't talk about data sharing. We can't talk about research when the practices of those who are conducting the research remains unknown. At an institutional, national level, we need structures, we need systems, we need policies. We need to start that journey, and I'm really happy that Uganda is already, it's already leading by example. At an institutional level, we need structures. The very least, we need to have a research integrity officer who can be able to supplement the activities of research ethics committees. We need to commit or invest in financial and human resources, but most importantly, we also need to nurture a supportive environment for responsible conduct of research, and we need to create awareness. This is still lacking. We should not just copy and paste policies, guidelines, and principles from the global north. We need to start seriously to co-create and co-own these, these things that come from the global north. Africa must participate in shaping the global discourse in research integrity. And personally, I feel the debate on research integrity will always remain incomplete without the voice and contribution of Africa, because Africa consumes research output, I mean, the research output from Africa is consumed globally. It's not just for Africa. And therefore, responsible conduct of research is key for Africa and for East Africa. I want to say that nothing about us without us is for us. So let's get on the table. Let's go on the discussion table to really contribute on this research integrity, discourse. This is important. I want to say, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, we must go together. And that is why I call upon, stakeholders of research integrity to come together and begin this journey towards promoting research integrity in and for Africa. I want to end up by acknowledging these two ladies who have been very instrumental in supporting me in, the African Research Integrity, network as steering committee members. And I want to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present in this very beautiful and lovely conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kombe. Our questions will come in the Q&A session. So we are going to go straight to the second talk, which will be presented by Dr. Jaime Hernandez from the Department of U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, who works in the Office of Human Research Participant Protection, and is going to talk about latest revisions in the Common Rule and the implications for research in Uganda and the region. We are aware that the Code of Federal Relations was revised recently, and the changes took effect on 21st January 2019. So to shed more light on this, welcome Dr. Jaime Hernandez from the US. Thank you.
Great, thank you all for having me. Can you guys confirm that you can hear me?
Yes. Yes, we hear you.
Yep, okay, great. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So I apologize, I'm gonna look like I'm looking in the wrong direction. Is that I have the camera on a different screen than the presentation. But good morning to you all, and thank you for having me. Today I wanted to talk about, first of all, I have to give you that mandatory disclaimer that the opinions expressed here are my own opinions and not that of the Department of Health and Human Services. And so I was asked to talk about the implications for Uganda and the regions, and the general region of the revisions to the Common Rule. And as I was trying to put this presentation together, and I started looking at the questions that we most commonly get from not only from Africa but from other countries around other countries outside of the United States, I realized that instead of just jumping straight into the revisions for the Common Rule, I think I wanted to first clarify or introduce the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services regulations for the protection of research participants, also known as the Common Rule, and discuss when the requirements of the Common Rule apply. Because a lot of the questions that we receive from outside of the United States have to do with whether you need to even comply with the requirements of the Common Rule. So I think that's very important to understand before understanding the changes to the revised Common Rule, which I will discuss later. Let's talk a little bit about HHS, and HHS means the Department of Health and Human Services, the regulations for protecting people who participate in research. These regulations contain 5 subparts. Of these 5 subparts, subpart A is often referred to as the Common Rule because it has been adopted by 19, I think this year it's 20 U.S. federal departments or agencies have adopted the same subpart. That's what most of us know, the requirements for informed consent, the exemptions, all of that is under subpart A, which is often called the common rule. However, research that is funded by the Department of Health and Human Services, and that includes the National Institute of Health, must comply with all 5 of the subparts, including subpart B that has additional protections for pregnant women and fetuses, subpart C with additional protection for for prisoners, subpart D with additional protection for children. So if you are conducting a research that is sponsored by NIH, you have to comply with all the subparts. Now, what is that the common rule require? First, when does it apply? So in general, and I highlighted this in bright green because it's very important, the requirements of the common rule apply when your institution is engaged in non-exempt human subjects research. Now, before we talk about what is engaged in non-exempt human subject research, let's address a couple of questions that we get very often. The first one is, what if my research is not funded by the federal government of the United States? Do I have to comply with the regulations? So the answer is maybe, sometimes. There's also FDA regulations for the Food and Drug Administration that are very similar to the HHS regulations. And they do apply to pharmaceutical companies and other research that is not federally funded. You also have to make sure that there's not other regulations from the states, from the federal government, or local from you guys that may require complying with the common rule. I can give you an example of the state of New York that requires all research in the state to comply with the common rule, regardless of whether it's federally funded. But most importantly is your institutional policies, your own institution. Many institutions have chosen voluntarily to apply the common rule or very similar standards to all research, regardless who's funding the research. So it is possible that even though your research is not federally funded, you still have to comply with the requirements of the common rule. But it's because it's required by your institution, not by the US, by HHS. Now, the second question that we get very often is, what if the research takes place outside of the United States? The regulations say that, and this is in section 46101A, that these regulations may also apply to research outside of the United States. And then in section 101H, we clarify that when the research takes place outside of the United States, sometimes the standards are different. And it is possible that the department head, and here we're talking the head of the Department of Health and Human Services. This is not the IRB. This is not a decision made by the researcher or the president of the university. This is a decision made by the department, by the director of the Department of Health and Human Services, that can decide that the protections at the other country are equivalent to the ones in the United States, and then there's no need to comply with the ones in the United States. To my knowledge, this has never happened. So I wouldn't. I get a lot of questions about equivalent protections, and it is a difficult determination to make. So the most important thing to keep in mind about when your research takes place outside the United States is that the regulations also say that regardless of the applicability of these regulations, that doesn't affect whether the research has to comply with your local regulations. What that means is that if the regulations apply to your research, it will apply regardless of where your research takes place. It also means that you may have to comply with additional regulations, the Uganda regulations, or for example, or the regulations of the place wherever the research is taking place. And that takes us back to, I'm saying that this is the case if the regulations apply. That takes us back to where we were before. When do the regulations apply? What does it mean to be engaged in non-exempt human subjects research? To make this determination, we are gonna ask these questions backwards in that sentence. We are going to, it's very important that we ask this question in the order in which I'm gonna give them to you. First, we're gonna ask, does the activity involve research? And here in little font in parentheses, I am including the section of the regulation where you will find the definition of research, so you can look it up. But we're not going, because of short time, we're not going into in details into any one of these concepts. So first, we're going to ask, does the activity involve research? If the answer is no, if it is not research, the regulations don't apply. But if the answer is yes, then we ask the second question. Does the research involve human subjects? Again, if the answer is no, this is research without human subjects, the regulations don't apply. But if the answer is yes, this is research with human subjects, then we ask the third question. Is it exempt? Does it meet the criteria for a series of exemptions that are listed in the regulations under 46.104? If the answer is yes, it meets the criteria for one of the exemptions, then it's exempt from having to comply with the regulations. So it doesn't have to comply with the requirements of the regulation because it is exempt. But if the answer is no, then we have non-exempt human subject research. And we're going to ask the fourth question. Is my institution engaged in this research? So one thing to keep in mind is that these first three questions, we're going to ask those three questions about the entire research protocol, the entire research, all locations, all sites, all universities. We're going to ask the full research protocol. If the full research protocol is either exempt or is not research or is not human subjects, then there's no need to worry about engagement. But if the full research protocol is non-exempt human subjects research, then we're going to ask the fourth question only about your institution. For the fourth question, we're only going to look at this one institution to determine whether the institution is engaged or not in the research. So here are some potential scenarios where the institutions will be engaged. For example, if an institution from Uganda, and I'm using Uganda as an example, it could be any country in the region or in the world, really. If an institution for Uganda is the direct recipient of an HHS funds for research, that will make that institution engaged in human subjects research, correct? Now, it could be the case that a US institution is the sole recipient of an HHS grant for non-exempt human subject research in Uganda, but is not collaborating with any institution in Uganda. In this case, the US institution will be engaged. So it will have to comply with the US regulation, and it may have to comply with any additional Uganda regulations. And then the third scenario is where the US and Uganda institutions are collaborating, working together on the same research, in which and they both receive HHS funds for non-exempt human subject research. Then they're both engaged and have to comply with the US regulations, and they have to comply with the Uganda regulations as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about the revisions to the common rule. And I'm gonna, excuse me for taking a sip of coffee, but it's 3 o'clock in the morning here. let's talk about the 2018 revisions. A couple of helpful terms to keep in mind is when I say or when you see in writing either pre-2018 rule or the pre-2018 requirement, that refers to the original common rule that was published in 1991. That's the one before the revisions. And when you see the terms 2018 rule or the 2018 requirements or the revised common rule, that is referring to the revisions, the post 2018 revisions, the ones that are in effect since 2018. Okay, so why did we update, or why did OHRP go ahead with the updating the revised common rule? First, we wanted to improve wanted to further promote individual autonomy and also add the broad consent option for secondary research. And another big important reason for updating the common rule was to reduce administrative burden on IRBs by making some changes that made the IRBs work better, but did not take away any protections from the human subjects, such as, for example, removing some activities from the definition of research. These were activities that already had protections elsewhere in the federal regulation. So there was no need to also have them comply with the common rule. We also expanded some of the exemptions, and then we created the single IRB review requirement for cooperative research to avoid duplication of IRB review in many institutions. So what do these changes, what does it mean for you guys in Uganda and the region in Africa? How does this affect you? First, the activities that were excluded from the definition of research, including, and this is kind of important because some public health surveillance activities were excluded from the definition of research, especially during the COVID pandemic. This may come pretty often. This is not anything that you may call a public health surveillance activity. It has to meet that definition in parentheses at 46102L2. That's where you will find the definition. If it meets that definition, and very important, it requires the involvement of an official public health entity, an official government public health organization. Also, what I mentioned that we expanded the exemption, so now more research than before will meet one of the exemption categories. That means more research will be exempt from having to comply with the requirements of the common rule. And then we added two new exemptions for secondary research. Those are exemptions 7 and 8 that required broad consent for the storage and the future use of information or biospecimens that is collected for a different purpose than the study in front of you. Those are three important changes. However, the problem with these changes is that they affect activities that are either not research or activities that now are exempt. So what that means for whether it is an institution in Uganda, remember the three scenarios that I mentioned, whether it is an Uganda institution alone, a US institution alone in Uganda, or a US and a Uganda institution working together. That means that IRB review is not going to be required, and informed consent is not required for any activities that are either exempt or that do not meet the definition of research. Therefore, you may be seeing some activities that in the past you will have to review, or let me back up, because you may still have to review it. And this is what I wanted to clarify by saying that other requirements may still apply to this research. The fact that the research is exempt or not required to comply with the US requirements doesn't mean that it's exempt from your own local requirements. Therefore, you may come across research that in the past would have had to be reviewed by the United States. But since 2018, there's no requirement for IRB review in the United States. However, there may be HIPAA for privacy requirements, or there may still be requirements in your own local countries or regions that are above the requirements from the United States. I hope that's making sense. Also, the other big change that happened is that when two institutions are collaborating together, two institutions are both engaged in the same project, then that triggers the single IRB requirement. However, the regulations require a single IRB only for US institutions and for the part of the research that is conducted in the United States only. Therefore, for the three scenarios that I was talking about, whether it's Uganda alone, it wouldn't apply because it's not a US institution, or whether it's an institution only in Uganda, it wouldn't apply because first, it's only one institution, and second, the research is not in the United States. And then in the third one, where you actually have two institutions collaborating, even though that's collaborative research, it doesn't trigger the single IRB requirement for any part of the research that is taking place in Uganda. And again, Uganda is just an example. So even though this is a very important change in the revised common law, it's very unlikely that it will have any effects on research outside of the United States. Now, there's some very important changes to the informed consent requirements. For example, now the informed consent most informed consent forms are required to start with a key information section at the beginning of the form. And that key information is supposed to help the potential participant understand the reasons why they might or might not want to participate in the research. And this is very important because in the past, we're used to write informed consents in a way that explains what the research is about. What is required now is to be put into context and not only say what the research is about, but why would you not want to participate in the research? Are there reasons why, for example, you may have these procedures done outside of the research? You don't have to participate in the research. You can just talk to a different doctor and get the procedures done somewhere else. That should be explained in the consent form now, because those are reasons why the participants may not want to participate in the study. Also, the basic elements of informed consents, these are the elements that are required for all consent forms. And the additional elements, those are the ones that are required when applicable only. There are some new elements in both cases, some new required elements and some new additional elements of informed consent. And also there's a new drafting standard for the type of information that must be included inside the consent form. And again, the purpose of these drafting standards are to help put the consent form in context for the research participant. It's not enough to just give them a 30-page list of a 30-page long list of information, like a volume of information. We should be putting this information into context in a way that explains why should they or should they not participate in the research. Also, there's been an addition of broad consent. I mentioned this earlier, that for the future storage and research use of identifiable information or identifiable by specimens. Notice that this applies only to secondary research. And second, only to when the materials are identifiable. This is optional. There's no requirement to do broad consent. And like I said, it's available only to secondary research. This is when you're doing a new analysis on information or biospecimens that are collected for a different purpose. It could be, for example, medical records could be information collected for clinical care, or biospecimens that were collected during surgery. Or you could be doing the research with information that was collected at school for educational purposes. All of those are examples of secondary research. The advantage of using broad consent is that it requires less specificity than the traditional consent form. However, you must comply with a set of standards. There are 46.116D as in David in the regulations. So it's not broad. It's not so broad that you can just say, I'm going to use your information for future research. That is too broad. There are a series of standards that you have to keep, that you have to comply with. But it allows for a consent that is broader and less specific to use for future research of material that has already been collected. What does this mean for you guys? It means, first of all, if you're doing it, if you're, again, the three scenarios that I mentioned earlier, if this is an Uganda institution that is the primary recipient of a grant, therefore you're engaged in non-exempt human subject research, and you must comply with the new informed consent format and the new standards, right? Same thing if the U.S. institution is doing research in Uganda, the U.S. institution will have to comply with the new standards for informed consent. But this also means that whatever additional, because remember what I said at the beginning, that the U.S. regulations doesn't mean that you still have to comply with any additional local Uganda requirements or local for the region or for any specific country. So this means that your local reviewers may start to see some consent forms that look different than they used to look in the past. These consent forms should start with the key information, and this consent form should be better drafted and should be drafted in a way that helps research participants make a decision whether they should participate or not. And then again, if the U.S. and the Uganda institutions are collaborating and they're both, engaged in non-exempt human subjects research, then they both will have to comply with these new standards of informed consent. And if there are different informed consents for different countries, let's say the research is being conducted both in the United States and in Uganda, but there is a different informed consent for each side, both informed consents will have to comply with the new standards. I know that this is very short and it's a very, 20,000 feet view of how the changes of the common rule may affect you guys. But I wanted to take a few minutes at the end of my time to tell you about a series of educational resources that OHRP has put together for research participants. This is to educate the public about participating in research. There's some videos, there's infographics, and there's a series of questions to ask that have become very popular. People could print these questions, and when they're talking to the researchers about participating in the research, but also the researchers can print these questions when talking to the potential participants, and it's just a series of bullet points on what you should be discussing when talking about informed consent and participating in research. It's a very, very good resource. We have also put together a series of resources for researchers, including a 3-part human research protections training, And there's a series of resources for the common about the revised common rule that you guys may find useful. And there's also there's a series of videos, and I wanted to let you know that there's a very good video that I like. That is a presentation by one of my colleagues about simplifying informed consent. So those are all very good resources for research for research teams too. And I think I'm doing well with time. Thank you very much. That is our email address, ohrp@hhs.gov. Always every day somebody from our office will check that email address. That doesn't mean you will get an answer the same day, because we get a lot of questions. But if you have any questions for us, please, I beg you, feel free to send us your questions at ohrp@hhs.gov, or you can visit our website. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And I don't know if I have time or if it's even possible to take any questions, but I'll be happy to take some if possible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Jamie. And we are deeply honored because of your being able to tune in at 3 a.m. So we thank you very much, but it is that important that we hear from an official of your standing, because of how much funding we also get from, federal funds, from government funds. So please, we request you stay around for a little bit until the questions and answer session. Right now, I also apologize for the time, but we are going to catch up. We are moving into our last speaker before the Q&A session, and this will be Dr. Francis Bajunirwe from Mbara University, where he is a faculty member. And Francis is a trained epidemiologist, medical doctor, who conducts a lot of community studies in rural Uganda, as you'll see there in his profile. Francis, it's a pleasure to have you present about informed consent and all these challenges, including data sharing, which you have recently published a nice seminal commentary in the Lancet about data sharing. So, Francis, you're well posed also, because you are the current chair of the REC in Mbarara, but also, for us on a personal note, the immediate past chair of the recent UNREC that we had before COVID. You are welcome, Francis. Kindly take your 20 minutes, maybe 25, but 20 because of the time. I'm sorry to have to limit you to that. You're welcome, Francis.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to thank the UNCST for inviting me to make this presentation. One of the downsides of the epidemic is we've had to organize a virtual conference, but I guess the upside is that the participation is overwhelming. I can see it's over 500 people, so this is very nice. So I'm going to share my screen and present the topic that is on the agenda. And for purposes of bandwidth, I'm going to have to stop my video sharing so that I'm sure that this presentation is successful given the limitations on my bandwidth. All right, so the topic of my presentation is informed consent for research during epidemics, and not forgetting that this conference is actually about research integrity, but looking at the challenges, the controversies that this presents, and possibly the lessons that we can learn from this. The summary of my presentation is really going to start with background to informed consent, things that we are probably very familiar with, but I'll focus more on the unique features that the epidemic presents, Then I'll talk about the challenges, and I'll make some propositions on alternate approaches. And these are purely off cuff, and so these are open for discussion. We will look at some advantages and disadvantages of each of these, and then a conclusion. So first of all, what's informed consent? I think we had about some of this from Dr. Jamie's presentation. We're all familiar with informed consent. We know that this is required before we enroll people in a study. But we've also heard many times that informed consent is a process. It's not just a document that is signed. And this consent process involves giving information. And now we've heard that there's change in that approach, that investigators will be required to present even more specifics about whether the participant may not participate. But we know the consent form is drawn from the ethics principles, which are well enshrined in the document, the Nuremberg Code, the Helsinki Declaration, and the Belmont Report. But very importantly, and this is going to play a key role in our understanding of the rest of the presentation, is that there are three key considerations for the informed consent, and that is information, comprehension, that is understanding, and voluntariness. And voluntariness can be very complex, as we know that it's something we don't commonly measure, but we commonly ignore as well, and assume that when we present information, participants will simply say yes to the study. So the traditional informed consent process involves a document, as we know, and any researcher in the room will know that that is something they treasure so much. As soon as they get that signature, that's the evidence that the study has been, the participant has been enrolled well. But in an epidemic situation, that might change. We think research in epidemics is important, and I'm going to present some reasons why. Epidemics are events of nature, and I know that given the plethora of information that is circulating around, some people may be in disagreement, but we broadly know that epidemics are events of nature, and therefore they present a natural setting or a laboratory for an investigator to conduct experiments. Epidemics present new organisms. There may be new strains that may warrant genotyping to understand the epidemiology, but also allow us to describe the natural history, especially if the organism is new. And therefore, we may be able to test new diagnostics, vaccines, and treatments. But also, we can understand a lot about the pathology, especially in epidemics that involve mortality, where post-mortem research may further the understanding. So given the nature of epidemics, there are some unique settings that emerge. One is that oftentimes there's actually no standard of treatment, standard of care or any standard treatment. And that often causes anxiety because persons that are infected feel that they have a death sentence over their heads. There's also high infection rates and sometimes mortality as well. And this is even worse in resources, limited resource settings. And then there's tensions about what should we prioritize? Is it the research or is it the care? And there's also a lot of information that is circulating, the so-called infodemic on top of the epidemic, and the misconceptions about the disease. All of this in combination heighten the levels of anxiety. Now, all of this combination presents challenges to the informed consent process as we know it. And I've lumped up all of these, and I'm going to go over these challenges in more detail. But just quickly, you can see that there's an infectious disease, there's isolation sometimes, quarantine, lockdowns, the misconceptions, information is changing quickly. Sometimes the scientists are not sure, and sometimes they're arguing even in public. Patients are admitted in the intensive care units. voluntariness and decision capacity is questionable. And participants are dying, and people are interested in research after death. Samples are being collected. How do we manage all of these? So let's go over some of them. We understand, of course, that data has to be collected if research needs to be done. Now, study participants need to be protected. Investigators also need to be protected. That's one thing people often forget, that sometimes the risk is not on the research, on the study participants, but the risk may also be on the researchers. We know also that epidemics involve isolation, and this isolation, unfortunately, may have a burden on the mental health of study participants, and trying to enroll them may be their only way to socialize. And so their interest in study participation is not driven out of the motivation to become involved in the research, but simply to socialize. But then we also know lockdowns and limited transportations. This picture here is taken from downtown Kampala, and if it weren't for the Mapera House in the background, I think some of you may not even recognize where this was taken from. Then we have the conceptions that also circulate, and study participants are unsure whether by getting into the study, this is my only chance to get something that is close to an effective treatment, but not forgetting that there's randomization and there's a placebo, and that you might be randomized to the placebo arm. And so that causes questions and sometimes confusions with the participants unable to weigh between the benefits and the risks. In an epidemic situation, there's a lot of information circulating. And not only are study participants unsure, but even the researchers. I think we've seen evolution in the knowledge of what we know about COVID, for example. At the beginning, we were asking ourselves, is this airborne? Is this droplet? Should I wear one mask, or is it 2 or 3 masks? Hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin now. And people resort to such engines. And unfortunately, such engines cause even more confusion. And imagine you're enrolling a study participant who has been Googling. So in the midst of all of this, we have publications being retracted and arguments staged out in public, and participants are left sometimes lost as to whether science could be trusted anymore. In the severe cases, some patients are admitted and they need to fight for their lives, but there is interest in research. Who is going to consent participants in the ICU? Is it the next of kin that provides the consent, but they're probably too distressed to even provide proxy consent? Then we also question whether voluntariness and decision capacity still holds. There's fear of infection, uncertainty, the vulnerability that may arise in the midst of all of this. And some people have suggested that investigators should be able to measure voluntariness before consent. But is this also feasible? And there's also interest in research after death. And this even becomes more controversial. A lot of specimens may be collected and participants may have passed on. And who will consent for this? Is it something we could consider in forms of advanced written notices, for example, that might solve the problem but may not be the magic silver bullet? And then there's a lot of interest in biobanking. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of routine samples that were collected, and this may be repurposed for research. But there are questions that hang over this, issues related to storage, shipment, and even sharing. And who consents for the sharing? We had Dr. Jamie Hernandez talking about broad consent becoming a prerequisite rather than the blanket consent. But there's also worries about risk of biopiracy. We heard about this scenario in the recent Ebola epidemic in West Africa. So in the midst of all of these challenges, should research regulation be relaxed? And if so, what should be relaxed and to what extent? Some may suggest consent waivers, but this may not necessarily be the solution, because we know that even based on the basic prerequisites for waiving informed consent, there still has to be a minimum that is required. The research must involve no more than minimal risk. And we know that most of the studies in epidemics actually do not meet this criteria. And so we have to think of alternate approaches. And this includes verbal consent, short form consent, digital formats, which may include videos, audios, or red cap, and then lastly, advance notices. And I want to think of these as lying on a spectrum. If you think of a linear scale, that they range from what is a standard written informed consent onto the extreme spectrum, which is the waiver. The e-consent is attractive because there's been a lot of growth in the e-consent since COVID. And in fact, the FDA did release some documents making some recommendations. But there's a big disclaimer there: when appropriate technology is available. And so this leaves a lot of space. Now, there's studies that have been done that show that indeed e-consent is actually possible and feasible, as shown in this cohort study that was done in the United States. And there's also another nice research letter written by Jeton that also documented the feasibility of this. But probably the most compelling evidence came from this study here relating to biobanks that was done in 3 regions in the United States, which was a randomized trial comparing the electronic consent processes versus the face-to-face. And the evidence did show that indeed the study was, the e-consent was not only feasible, but actually was equivalent. And they used interfaces such as what you see here, quite interactive, and also using a mixture of pictures to enhance understanding. And in this diagram here, which is a box plot showing the outcomes, you can see the main scores on the Y scale, which is the understanding, and the blue and pink boxes represent the 2 groups. The blue group is the electronic informed consent, and the pink is the face-to-face. And you can see that the boxes represent near comparisons based stratified by the 3 groups in the 3 regions. So this really provides evidence that indeed electronic informed consent may replace face-to-face consent validly. However, not all studies showed positive results. I think there was this one study in the UK which provided some negative results, showing that indeed, though many studies have shown a lot of promise for electronic consent, there was limitations in terms of this HPV vaccination study among adolescent girls. So as I conclude, there are key considerations for the e-consent process. One is that there's got to be accessibility, user-friendliness. We have to think of user engagement and comprehension. There are different groups, categories of participants, including educational levels. But we also have to think of data security, the platform secure, the impact on research teams. This includes costs and also the burden. And then lastly, we shouldn't forget that we are in an integrity research conference. We have to think about guidance and compliance to the standards. And I have a feeling that maybe we may have guidelines developed to help us on how we can develop e-consent. So there are some benefits and challenges to e-consent processes. The benefits are many. In a pandemic, we are sure that there may be lesser chances of transmission, but also we have challenges that technology is not easily accessible and some persons are illiterate to the technology, but also there are policies that may limit the implementation of these platforms. So in conclusion, informed consent, I think, still remains a core component for ethical research, including epidemics. We shouldn't seek ways to circumnavigate the process. I think we should embrace the challenges and develop some, adopt some alternative measures which are innovative, acceptable, in order to sustain the traditional informed consent. So we should embrace the technology that is available, and this is going to take a collective effort from investigators, researchers, research ethics committees, and regulatory bodies. So as I conclude, I recognize the Mbarara University Research Ethics Education Program, which is funded by the Fogarty Center and supports the Masters of Public Health at MAST for supporting some of my work. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francis. I apologize for having given you a time limit because you took less than what you were told. So it is me who is in the wrong here. So we are now moving quickly into our question and answer session. But because we are behind, we are going to select a few questions. Although we keep, welcoming your questions in the Q&A. Please type them there. At some opportune moment, we shall respond in the chat. So I will read down a few questions and then probably indicate which presenter should address this one, but anyone is welcome to address the questions or to comment about them. So we'll go back to our first presenter, just in case, not to spend too long and forget about Dr. Kombe's presentation. The first question here is, how can the need for increased research funding be brought on priority or be given priority? I think that's what they were meaning, on the priority list in African countries in general. And can you comment on how our policymakers can be brought to appreciate the scientific innovations that are key in transforming our societies? I think I probably should read one question at a time. So, Dr. Kombe, I hope you're still there.
Oh, yes, I'm still here. I got both the questions. One is, how can the call to increase funding for research be promoted, if I got you right? And then how can we bring our policymakers on board to contribute to basically the policy making process? Well, I would say there has been efforts to really come up with what I would say acts of parliament and even at a regional level within the continent to subscribe to some statements that have identified the need for countries to commit at least 2% of the, I think 2%, if I'm not wrong, 2% of the GDP to research and development. Many countries have ratified these conventions, but on the ground, when it comes to budgeting, I think what goes research and development is much less than what these conventions have, recommended. So I think I really do not know what the problem is, but I would say, as stakeholders in research, we need to engage the political class, because the political class are the people who make policies, who make it happen. They're the people who are responsible for making, also approving things. It is sad that there's quite between researchers and the political class, and I think we really need to push that. Not so many politicians are even aware or appreciate the need for research, and that's a serious point for them to be able to to even pass laws and acts that promote a conducive environment for research, but also for them to approve budgets that can go into supporting the need for more research and they need to be able to understand and appreciate the importance of research. So for me, we need to bring everybody on the table and get them to understand where do we come from and where do we want to go. For me, that is a bit. Yeah. It's still the same, or I would say that the answer is the same for the second question as well. How do we, bring in the political or the policymakers to appreciate the need for for example, policies and legal frameworks? We need to engage them. We are here. We don't want to commit the same, the same omissions that we were committed during the, when ethics, when research ethics was being propagated and introduced. We totally missed out on the table, and that is why we are here complaining about these principles, universal. How can we decolonize research ethics? Because we were never on the table. I think now it's time to bring everybody on board, let them understand that research integrity is important, and we move together as a, as a team, and not leave anyone behind. So it is our responsibility, the researchers. It is a responsibility for any, research integrity and research stakeholder to think about the people who are missing on this table, so and bring them on board to begin to appreciate the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kombe. We'll continue to interact with you also on the chat. Please just look out on the chat as there may be some questions there. But one thing I've also realized here, and allow me to just, recognize in our presence the head of the Uganda National Health Research Organization, the executive director. So what this reminds me, yes, thank you, sir. What this reminds me is, I think it is appropriate at the end of our Q&A to have few minutes where he can respond to some of the comments or questions that are also being raised, in part because all this work falls under the mandate of UNRO. So please, you will allow me to invite you at the end of this Q&A session for a few minutes, Dr. Kware. Thank you so much. Now, I want to move on to Jamie. I have a question for you here. There are about 2 questions, but I'll read them together because some are overlapping. How do you reconcile differences between the common rule and the Ugandan provisions for specimen handling? We may not allow either sharing of specimens, or may not allow even open access to data, So how do you reconcile these differences? So as you think about this question, very closely related is another one about research ethics and research integrity, particularly for researchers, local researchers who, quote unquote, are suppressed in collaborative research. So because they are suppressed, sometimes they may need these provisions that either prevent what you would see as open data sharing or specimen sharing access. Over to you, Jamie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to start by saying that I am not 100% familiar with Uganda regulations for specimens. So I have a general idea of where the region is in terms of regulations, but I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what the regulations are in Uganda. But I think one contradiction that we often encounter is that the United States regulations, if the biospecimens cannot be identified, they don't meet the regulatory definition of human subjects. And if you remember my presentation, if it is not human subjects, then the regulations don't apply. Now, that contradicts a lot of more regional regulations that protect research with biospecimens, even if it is not identifiable. One thing to keep in mind is that when we say the regulations don't apply, it doesn't mean that the wild west and you can do whatever you want with the biospecimens. You know, there's still other standards of ethics, like the ethical standards of your own profession, and just like generally accepted principles of research ethics and research integrity that you brought up earlier as well, that require that you still, even if not covered by the common rule, that you still protect the privacy and confidentiality of these biospecimens. That you try not to identify the people, the donors of the specimens. So there's, even if the regulations don't apply, there's other moral responsibilities that researchers have towards the specimens. And I think I addressed a little bit your question about research integrity as well. Now, research integrity in the United States is dealt with another office within the Department of Health and Human Services that is called the Office of Research Integrity, ORI. So I don't want to speak for ORI, and I cannot speak for ORI. But from my experience, I have heard a lot of issues with preventing access to biospecimens to other researchers, or hoarding the biospecimens, not allowing other researchers to have access to the information, and the implications that that may have for research integrity. Definitely, one of the main pillars of research and progress for humanity is collaboration, not hoarding biospecimens, but it is a problem. I don't know how extensive the problem is, because again, I'm not at the Office for Research Integrity, but I have heard issues related to that. I hope that answers your question.
Right. That's fair enough. Fortunately, as I said, on the Uganda side, we shall maybe listen to Dr. Sam Okware to get some more confirmation on some of these points, more affirmative points. Thank you so much. Francis, I want to ask you 3 questions, but they are pointing to the same issue, so you respond to them all at once. The first question, which is what I would like you to respond to last, but let me read it first, is how do you deal with mandatory vaccination against COVID and still respect the rights of the respondents? But as you think about it, let me first ask the 2 questions I would like you to think about to lead us into mandatory testing. The first one is, how do you reconcile broad informed consent with the need for researchers to ensure participants' confidentiality? So broad consent, maybe you'll briefly talk a little bit about that, but then the last but related question is someone I actually needed you to share some guidance, or maybe all the speakers and the audience, some guidance on consenting during phone interviews. Would you record the consent? Would you audio record the consent, and then just note the participant verbally consented. That is phone interview, but because you've discussed about the need to embrace technology, we are thinking about it, how to give some guidance on phone interviews. So the three questions, Francis, I would request they lead into then mandatory vaccination. You have about 3 minutes though. Right.
Okay. The question on, well, you said I should answer that last, and maybe I should just keep that to the end. Let me talk about the phone consent first. So this is a proposal. As you know, there's been challenges with getting the study participants, and many investigators who had ongoing studies had to make amendments quickly to incorporate the pandemic. Now, one of the amendments was engaging with the respondents through the phone. So it's an acceptable format in many ways. I think what we need to be aware of is protecting the confidentiality of participants. And how do we engage participants in this media without compromising their confidentiality? If I'm going to call you and ask you questions about your health, how am I sure that nobody's hearing what you're answering? So it's something we need to discuss, of course, as we go forward, because as I mentioned, there are no guidelines on electronic consent, and it's really up to the individual researchers for now to ensure that all the mechanisms that are in place don't compromise confidentiality. The other question was, should we record? So the question about recording means that you now have a digital record of a voice of somebody, and this is potentially identifiable. And you have to ask those questions. How do I ensure that this identifiable information is stored securely and won't be compromised? I can't answer the question as to whether it's okay or not okay to record. I think that eventually flows back to you, you the investigator, to ensure that you can answer these questions. There was also a question on broad consent and confidentiality. So the broad consent, we talk about broad consent as opposed to blanket consent. Broad consent does carry some restrictions, as Dr. Jamie Hernandez mentioned. It doesn't mean that because it's broad, it's very broad, you can just about do anything. So there are restrictions within which you operate. So data sharing is one of those. And you've got to make sufficient justification for sharing, what you're sharing, who you're sharing with, and the reasons for sharing, of course, and how in the process participant confidentiality will be maintained. We want science to be, I think everybody wishes to see science being enhanced. It would not make sense to have samples stored and being unused. I think ultimately we want to see that materials that are collected are harnessed and contribute to what we know. But we also don't want to harm participants in the process. So the last question, and I'm looking at the clock for the minutes you gave me, is the mandatory vaccination. Now, that is not a research program. That is the public health program, and I think we may need to distinguish between the two. I don't think mandatory vaccination programs have been embedded in research. So those two are very distinct entities, and mandatory vaccinations may be embedded within the constitution. There may be laws governing Uganda that require that you actually get vaccinated. And so I won't speak about those in that case. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Please just stick around and also comment in the chat if you are able to type, Francis, and of course Dr. Kombe and Dr. Hernandez, because some of these questions cannot just all be answered straight, right now, and with the clock bearing down on us. So just before I invite Dr. Samo Kware, I wanted to go back to any one of you three and ask, do you think, or how do you think IRBs or RECs for that matter can make the research process more friendly, particularly for junior researchers or any other new researchers who might be finding the processes very complex. And I'm thinking, because we are going digital, like you're saying, we should embrace digital. Maybe they will find RECs more friendly, or the whole process less hectic, while thinking about maintaining integrity. So maybe we'll start again with Dr. Hernandez. What do you think? Or if you're not on, are you still online, Jamie? Or as we wait maybe for Jamie, maybe Dr. Kombe, if you're still online.
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, he's gone. They've gone offline.
I'm still online, but I can't hear you guys. So I think you are maybe asking, you may be saying my name, but I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry. I speak with a very heavy accent, but it is you I'm talking to. Yeah. What do you think? Do you think IRBs or REC processes can be made more friendly as we go more digital? It's difficult. But Francis, what do you think? Just your comment, Francis, then I have to invite Dr. Sam Okware because of time.
Yeah, like,
just 1 minute.
Yeah, I think the moderator's sound is problematic. You need to fix it. I can hardly hear you as well. I hear, but I think I understood the question. We have learned in this pandemic that a lot of work can be done digitally. I mean, who thought that this conference would be virtual and we would be able to interact? Though with the challenges, like your audio, I can't hear you very well. I mean, that's some of the issues. I think this experience we're having right now answers your question. The issue is going to be adoption, the ability to embrace the technology. We have to understand the limitations, and I think I presented a slide on that. I don't want to repeat. But the uptake, I think, from what I have seen so far, recently the National Council of Science and Technology adopted the NRIMS, which applicants are using now at the local institutions. And the uptake is 100%. Nobody thought this was possible. So I think adopting digital platforms is the way forward. There's going to be challenges, of course, that it's easy for people who are in academia to interact with each other that way. It's going to be a lot harder when we deal with study participants who have little access to the technology, or even if they had access, they need a lot of education to be able to use it well. So it's going to be a learning curve, and I think slowly by slowly we'll get there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. As Dr. Okware gets ready to come and maybe give a few summary comments, I will let Cloud had a question for Dr. Okware. He may want to listen to it and then.
Thank you. This question is a carryover from yesterday. Some participant asked about the ethical legal frameworks in the region, and I think it didn't come out clearly. So I would like Dr. Kwari to comment, especially with regard to Uganda, how far we are with having ethical legal framework for research, research integrity and responsible conduct of research. Could you comment in the Ugandan case or general about the region?
You can't hear it.
foremost and paramount. There is no shortcut about that. There is no shortcut about that. Why? Because if you make a mistake and you're taken for litigation, your name is gone, and also the compensation. The compensation is so enormous. Right now, we are already in court of law trying to defend some of these scientists who have inadvertently reached one or two other small things in it. So really, it's important. And before we go there next time, because you see, the act, the Google Act, for instance, says that you can only be forgiven, you have no indemnity if your paper has been properly cleared. So if you're doing your own research quietly, you are likely expect to go on your own. And the compensation is just very heavy. We're talking about millions of shillings, millions of dollars. That's number one.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the session. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the session, but I would like, first of all, to thank the speakers, including those Dr. Andes, who has been tuning in in the wee hours. I would like to also thank. I would like to thank Cloud, my co-chair, and who should introduce himself properly because he didn't get that opportunity. But I would like to mention one thing, Cloud, as we close, that we are going into a very short interlude and we will play a video. We are playing some videos, so please do not log out, do not tune out. Just look at those training videos. They are very short training videos. Thank you so much for this session. Thank you.
Okay, we did not introduce ourselves when we were starting because of the issues we had.